Our third speaker is Andrew Doss, who is an attorney and writer whose work explores how process metaphysics might inform the changing shapes of international governance to address the 21st century's significant challenges. He has degrees from Georgetown University, Leiden University in The Hague, and Yale University. He recently served as the director of the Governor's Resilient Commission in the state of Louisiana. His paper title is The End of Sovereignty and the Hope of Process Models in International Governance Structures.
We want agency. He did not begin to hear it all at once. The protagonist of William Faulkner's Old Man remembers of the great Mississippi River flood of 1927. He suddenly became aware that he had been hearing it all the time, a sound so much beyond all his experience that up to this point he had been as oblivious of it as an ant or a flea might be of the sound of the avalanche on which it rides. The whole world is in the throes of a paradigm shift of understanding the agency of the human body in the cosmos. And Stephanie, the more than human body as well. It is a question that involves the pain of a history of violence, supremacy, dominated and dominating. For millennia of Western documented human history, humans have had a static, fixed cosmology in which bodies of all sorts are understood as sovereign, impermeably separate, bifurcated, subjects and objects bouncing off of each other like billiard balls, competing for leverage as subject, and lorded over by the ultimate subject of an impassable, immovable divine power. I label this here as a sovereignty-based framework, using the word sovereignty to indicate independence, autonomy, self-contained spheres of control. Suddenly, we are coming to a new understanding and experience of the human body in the cosmos. Moving through the ideas of Darwin, process, relativity, quantum, string theory, entanglement, liberation, feminist, black, and queer theologies, and concrete participation across fields such as technology, the environment, economics, our actual daily experience is newly one of deep, even overwhelming interconnectedness. A butterfly flaps its wings in China and a storm rages in New York may have been a thoughtful analogy for my dad's baby boomer generation, but for young people now, it is daily concrete reality. Perhaps a bat flaps its wings in China and a pandemic rages in New York. Our bodies are not only conceived of, but increasingly experienced as co-participatory, dynamic occasions deeply entwined of each other, the universe and God, making incarnate an ongoing process of ultimate creativity. This runs all the way up and down and requires the adaptation and invention of new models of living. A question we must answer in our age is how we find agency in such dynamic interconnectedness. We need a constructive vision. Globalization's watershed changes have left us feeling a lack of agency over not only our world at large, but our individual lives and our place in the lives of our communities. In the face of the digital revolution, pandemics, escalating socio-political tension due to increasing inequality, and the climate crisis, to name but a few, our future feels out of our control. Somewhere out there, forces beyond us, powers and principalities, direct our daily lives without clear definition, let alone accountability to us. We feel non-efficacious and without belonging. It is scary as hell. This feared and experienced lack of agency underlies the cultural and socio-political movement across the globe improperly labeled as populism. Brexit in England, Trump in the United States, Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, Meloni in Italy, and on, all elected by citizens indrawing against this paradigm shift, captured by rhetoric and reactionary policy that promises autonomy, localized control domestically, and nationalism globally. In short, agency. Specifically, a return to a nostalgic myth of agency within a sovereignty-based framework. Sovereignty was the word that Brexit promised to restore to take control back from EU imposition. Sovereignty was the cry and legal justification of Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro to reject international efforts to stop his burning of the Amazon. Conservative author John Fante defended Trump's obsessive use of the word sovereignty in each of his speeches before the UN, writing, "It all comes down to two words: who decides?" In other words, who has agency? So, quick survey. How many of you see, don't raise your hands, how many of you see beauty and reality and potential in process and are ready to compost the sovereignty-based framework? Okay. How many of you want to shed national sovereignty, which has been the basis of our international system since at least the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia? Okay. If you're serious about that, how many of you want to shed the United States Bill of Rights, women's health rights, indigenous and tribal rights, and our international human rights system altogether, all of which are based on body sovereignty? I meant it when I said this paradigm shift is scary as hell. What's going on is not merely a political realignment or a pendulum swing. It is not just progressive. This is a reformation of human society, perhaps unprecedented in history. The paradigm shift is bigger than any particular policy or party and can't be undone. Part of the very problem is that our old structures of thought and institutions are obsolete to address today's realities. Specifically, sovereignty-based systems are structurally incapable of addressing the trans-sovereign complexity of the biggest challenges we face, especially the climate crisis. Re-entrenching ourselves within obsolete structures will only make our pain worse. Instead, we need to deconstruct them and innovate new constructive structures. But to do so, we need a new story of the human body's agency, individually and collectively, within a process framework. To understand what governance is, first we need to know what it is to be a human body at all. In this paradigm shift, we in the West are transitioning from an understanding of the self as a sovereign, hermetically sealed container, toward a self that is an incarnate relation, perhaps analogous to a semiconductor. I haven't written a paper in the last 7 years without quoting Catherine Keller, and I'm not going to miss the chance now that she's in the room. Dr. Keller elucidates, "I am the complex unity of feeling that rises up at this moment in response to my feelings of the plural world. Everything in some sense is really part of me, however dimly felt. Every actual entity is present in every other actual entity. I cannot exist without in some sense taking part in you, in the child I once was, in the breeze stirring the down on my arm, in the child starving far away, in the flashing round of the spiral nebula. And inasmuch as I feel what I take account of, I may own it. I make the world my own world and so create myself." This is not abstract. As a concrete example, while prior generations understood that the inside of the human body was walled off from the outside world, microbiology teaches today that the human stomach alone has 10 times as much external bacteria in it as human cells. So even our actual bodies are made up of more that is not us than that which is. And without that bacteria, there would be no person. Stephanie yesterday taught me that viral DNA is even encoded in our DNA. From another perspective, did you know that what makes us human is that we music with a CK? Evolutionary biologists have learned that what distinguished humans from other intelligent animals is that our brains and nervous systems developed by socially observing that an action has an outcome, which can be mirrored to eventually build something. An ape can pick up a stick and throw it, but its brain is incapable of target practice. We, on the other hand, observe, mirror, and build. Our ancestors' first social gatherings, even before language, were banging stones to manufacture basic tools together. Uga hits a rock and it sharpens. Tunk, observing Uga, mirrors and builds upon that, and his rock sharpens. Now Uga, observing Tunk's action, mirrors and builds upon that, and her rock is sharper. And on, back and forth, observe, mirror, build, a rhythm, a syncopation. Evolutionary biologist Gary Tomlinson says that it was this literal rock music that shaped our brains. He calls this process musicking. It is social before individual, physical before cognitive. It is how we evolved to build tools. Eventually, we observed that grunts and primal sounds could have outcomes. We mirrored them, and even before we learned to speak, we found ourselves singing. This rhythm became our center in the natural universe, and this is the way that we are in relation with one another. The rhythm of walking, of holding hands, of language, a syncopation, a habituation, a formative ritual, observe, mirror, build, observe, mirror, build. Rhythm, ritual, liturgy. The mimetic musicking process doesn't just entrain our lives in immediate community and environment, but across time. According to Tomlinson, 1 million years ago, our brains developed the capacity to socially transmit learning across generations. He writes, musicking is implicated deeply in thinking at a distance. It developed alongside a release from proximity, whereby humans gradually gained the capacity to imagine things not present to the senses, ultimately leading to a poiesis, the process of bringing into presence something not present, an anticipated future. Perhaps, while sovereignty-based agency is limited to static, physical, or geographic proximity, this relationally anticipated future can be an essential element of process agency, the capacity to deliberately move across time into an imagined relational future. Our whole life, every interaction, conscious and unconscious, is engaged in this musicking rhythm. It is literally who we are, an incarnate process of constant mutual formation. James K.A. Smith examines how our collective formation, this musicking writ large, takes place in the daily habits, patterns, and rituals of broader society, what he calls cultural liturgies. He posits that these cultural liturgies are a form of worship understood in the fullness of the term. In practicing these often invisible and even automaticized cultural liturgies, we become what we worship. If we design our lives to worship sovereignty, we form ourselves as sovereign individuals. If we worship relational process, we form ourselves as relations. Governance, or public decision-making, is a cultural liturgy of formation, of musicking as a society. Bruce Jennings defines it as the overall process of coordinating, shaping, and directing individual and collective agency. At the global political level, the paradigm shift from a sovereignty to a process framework has dissolved traditionally defined divisions into an entirely unprecedented system of relationality called radical connectivity. The technological revolution, the interweaving of economies, the climate crisis, the breakdown of traditional institutions has splayed open every preconceived sphere of sovereignty. Geographic borders are increasingly experienced as legal constructions that don't align with our operating realities. Local and global are increasingly difficult to demarcate. Our belief in stomach walls and national walls are equally dissolving. In his book, The End of Big, Nico Mealy writes that one thing is certain: radical connectivity is toxic to conventional power structures. Today, before our eyes, the top-down nation-state model as we have known it is collapsing. Traditional sources of information like broadcast and print media are in decline. Aircraft carriers and other military hardware that for decades underpinned geopolitical power are obsolete and highly vulnerable, while organized violence remains a growing threat. Competitive hierarchies within industries are disappearing, traditional cultural authorities are fading. Everything we depend on to preserve both social stability and cherish values, including the rule of law and civil liberties, is coming unraveled. I want to pause to remind you of a few words to parallel what is happening in patterns of globalization and patterns of process thought. Sovereignty framework. Self-contained, separate, static, independent, freedom from imposition. The currency is power held and possessed in competition. The ideal is being a king or a queen, a sovereign authority in control. Process framework. Dynamic, co-participatory, relation, freedom in belonging. The currency is connectivity. The ideal is being an effective semiconductor, a hub that organizes and directs the flow of relations. Global strategic thinker Parag Khanna doesn't realize that he is understating the paradigm shift when he writes, "We are living through a change in change. Not merely a shift in structure from one superpower to multiple, but a far deeper one from a state-based order to a multi-actor system. Structural change happens every few decades. Systems change only every few centuries. Structural change makes the world complicated. Systems change makes it complex. International relations among states are complicated, while today's global network civilization is complex. Connectivity is the main cause of this complexity." New global macro patterns have emerged in the last decade that may be analogous to something like social concrescence. To name four. One, governance functions traditionally performed by government are now being carried out by a pluralism of entities, including government, intergovernmental organizations, IGOs, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, market agents, such as multinational corporations, microfinanciers, social entrepreneurs, and hybrid bodies, such as healthcare systems and universities. Two, successful governments act more as economic connectors than economic providers, connecting their constituents to resources with other governance actors in new partnerships across sector and geography. Three, with increasingly transparent interconnectedness across the globe, the success of any particular geographic community is based on how well it fulfills a dual mandate to serve both the citizens within its geographic boundaries and the citizens outside of them. Four, a complex pattern of two seemingly contradictory forces is operating in aggregation and devolution. Aggregation is the term used to describe universal interconnectedness across boundaries of all sorts, geographical, national, and cultural. Global oneness. Groups sharing important commonalities form a connection to one another and are prepared to take action together, despite distances and various forms of separation. Connectivity aggregates to share the mutual benefits of infrastructure, economic integration, labor migration, and political reconciliation between would-be competitors that helps maintain peace. Devolution, on the other hand, is a localizing movement, a desire for decentralization and for authority to be granted to smaller concentrations of communities, formed by geographical locale and by a common identity. This is part of why cities are becoming more economically important than nation states. Khanna writes that in addition to the traditional forces of anti-colonialism and ethnic grievance, the newer realities of weak and overpopulated states, struggles to control natural resources, accelerated economic competition, and even the rise of big data and climate change all point to more devolution in the future rather than less. As Tom's Texas energy independence disaster example set up, I'll note that the Western left has a prejudice to privilege devolution or localism, which denigrates the value and unstoppable reality of aggregation. This prejudice is itself another effort to return to a sovereignty framework of local autonomy and control that ignores the larger body, like deciding that the entire health of the hand depends on the forefinger alone. A forefinger's particular agency is discovered in its dynamic relation to thumb and other fingers and palm, its oneness in the hand. So too is the fascinating current cooperative global pattern of aggregation and devolution. so too is a process agency of Whiteheadian social concrescence. So just descriptively, not evaluatively, connectivity, pluralistic actors, the concrescence of the global in shared authority, mutual interdependence, a release from proximity. The world is in chaos and we might not make it, but is this not a move toward a process framework? Can we name that as the hope and more deliberately design and push ourselves and our systems into process models? There are exciting innovations in international governance that we don't have time to explore now, but I'll name briefly. Herman Green's Earth Law Center leads an exciting emerging legal field of practice. Other structural inventions include DAOs, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, teal organizational models, public policy making centered on the ritual of eating together, and global network infrastructures in which members of local decision-making councils sit with equal voting power on councils in sister communities around the world. I will note, though, that all of these innovations are emergent in a wide-open field of potential, but not yet actualization or practice. We don't know what will work. In conclusion, we ain't there yet. The good news is that the populist cry to return to the nostalgic myth of sovereignty-based agency is a death cry, a reaction and perhaps last gasp against the multi-millennia paradigm shift in the middle of which we find ourselves. The process framework is winning, and it carries the potential of a vision of justice and mutual interdependence. The bad news is that we might not survive it. Our sovereignty-based systems remain structurally incapable of addressing the trans-sovereign complexity of the biggest challenges we face, especially the climate crisis. But if we do survive, it will be because we are able to not only work out and tell a new constructive story of the human body's agency in a process cosmos, but to design process-based governance structures which can coordinate, shape, and direct, or observe, mirror, and build, or music that agency to the poesis of the anticipated future we desire. In the rush of the flood, Faulkner's protagonist quit yelling then and went back to paddling. He was not trying to outrun it. He just knew from experience that when it overtook him, he would have to travel in the same direction it was moving in anyway, whether he wanted to or not. And when it did overtake him, he would begin to move too fast to stop, no matter what places he might come to.